Hi gang, Saturnine Terminator armour is the most advanced form of personal defensive armour ever produced by the Imperium of Man, an imposing, lumbering mark that incorporates lost technology from before the fall of Old Night. But while it's a new entry to the battlefields of the Horus Heresy, it's not a completely new idea, for these models are themselves based on an ancient design from before the fall of 1990. Want some more Warhammer? Check out Arbitorian's Precinct House for book club and Tale of Four gamers, link below. So, Saturnine Terminators have returned to the battlefields of the Horus Heresy game, along with a whole load of lore to explain how that happened. But this isn't a totally new idea. Much like the Saturnine armour of the lore, this design is actually a reimagining of something much older. In this case, one of the oldest Terminator models in Warhammer history, and its introduction includes an actual retcon, something that Warhammer doesn't explicitly do that often. So, in this video, let's look at two things. First, the lore around what Saturnine armour actually is, and then how it got here. To their own annoyance, the Mechanicum of Warhammer 30k do not actually control all of the technology in the Imperium, at least not to the degree they do in the 41st millennium. At the time of the unification of Mars and Terra, many human planets across the galaxy sported distinguished technological legacies, sometimes holdovers from the Dark Age of technology, sometimes homegrown scientific discoveries. The Mechanicum even had smaller rivals within the solar system. Many of the elite of the Emperor's warriors, the most trusted, such as the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, utilised ancient and carefully guarded Terran technology. Sophisticated armour suits, such as dreadnoughts, were in use during Old Night. The ubiquitous bolter is a Terran weapon, and many psi-reactive technologies utilised by the secretive talons of the Emperor are also Terran in origin. The Emperor did not totally trust the priests of Mars to develop all the technology used to protect him. And similarly, the moons of Saturn, eventually united under a power named the Saturnine Ordo, had their own technological legacy, mostly specialising in void warfare. The Saturnine fleet was extremely powerful. Their standard military, the void hoplites of the Saturnine rams, were later considered the template for the solar auxilia. And this legacy of independent development had been helped along over the years by a renegade tech enclave who had left Mars and ended up settling on Saturn's 9th moon, Phoebe. And as far as any records show, it seemed that it was here, in the enclave on Phoebe, that Saturnine pattern Terminator armour would be developed. The various technologies that would eventually become Terminator armour were developed by a number of independent authorities and forges towards the end of the Unification Wars, as Terra and then the solar system were united under the rule of the Emperor. The aim of the project was to upgrade and then completely replace the power armour utilised by the Imperium's elite with something a bit heavier and more durable, and the various forges who worked on the project all utilised different ancient or newly rediscovered technologies in their version of the suits. All of these prototype suits were massively armoured, sealed against external conditions, and capable of carrying extremely heavy weapons. In fact, many had been developed from the sort of heavy exosuit that had been used for hazardous void operations, maintenance within void ship reactor cores, or missions in orbits plagued with micro debris. So it's perhaps no surprise that the mark developed by Saturn was one of the most technologically advanced. Saturnine Siege Terminator armour was the heaviest and most advanced form of armour to result from the project. Displaying on its chest the Saturnine Aquila, the symbol of Saturn within the Imperium, the armour was massively bulky and overscaled, more so than most other Terminator marks, which made it slow and lumbering on the battlefield, but that hardly mattered. Its armour was incredibly thick and durable, and was augmented by advanced thermal diffraction fields and layered energy shields with auxiliary emitters housed in its vast pauldrons that allowed it to shrug off incoming fire with ease. As a mark of its suitability for void combat, the armour was equipped with teleport synchronizers also built into those pauldrons, and transponders that could be linked to the suit of a commanding officer for relatively reliable teleportation. And its systems incorporated advanced targeting arrays, allowing its user to target multiple parts of the battlefield simultaneously. The vast power of its reactor also allowed it to be armed with some of the largest and rarest of early Crusade-era energy weapon systems, from heavy disintegrator cannons, all but unknown in later ages, to plasma bombards. A number of variants of this were produced, which used different systems and weapons, or included additional hard points for more armaments, but all of them were united by an exceptionally complex technological base and an extremely powerful reactor core, and all these design principles were expanded in order to create a mark of full-scale Dreadnought armour. Saturnine Dreadnought armour utilised many of the same technologies as the Terminator suits, but stood even taller than Leviathan Dreadnoughts, themselves a product of hidden Terran technology, and they bore a striking resemblance to another closely held Terran Dreadnought design, the Telemons, used by the Legio Custodes. Along with various other marks of Terminator armour, Saturnine was fielded during the earliest days of the Great Crusade, a boon to those first expeditionary fleets that departed the solar system, but these advantages came with serious disadvantages too. Terminator armour was generally popular within the legions, but the resulting suits were all too inflexible to be considered a replacement to power armour, and the complex Saturnine suit suffered even more. Like much of the rarefied technology of the Imperium, demand quickly outstripped supply. The suits were difficult to produce and maintain in any numbers, and particularly difficult to build in mobile legion forges, and they were also known to take something of a toll on their wearers. Like many mind impulse linked marks of Terminator and Dreadnought armour, the technology required a high level of skill and an exceptionally disciplined mind to make full use of. In fact, some reports stated that some form of natural cyber theurgy, or maybe even psychic potential, was needed for true integration with the suits. So while Saturnine was utilised across the solar system at the end of the Unification Wars and throughout the galaxy in the early Great Crusade, over time, the legions came to prefer easier to produce marks of armour. First the Cataphracti mark, and then the Tartaros and Indomitus marks that could all be manufactured in far larger numbers and maintained further and further out into the void. Despite its incredible capabilities as the Great Crusade pushed on, Saturnine Terminator armour became a rarely seen relic of a forgotten age, fondly remembered but rarely actually produced. It was only the patronage of a Primarch that would save it. The 18th Primarch, Vulcan of the Salamanders, had bent his technological knowledge and craftsmanship to unlocking the secrets of the technology that was used within the armour. He improved upon the design in many ways, and in the latter years of the Great Crusade, the Salamanders Legion tested various prototype refinements of Saturnine armour, modified to be easier to produce so that the legions might once again field them in numbers. The resulting suits retained the awesome size, durability and power of the original Saturnine project, but this time could be created on the go in Legion forges and repaired and maintained on campaign. The stage was all set for the widespread return of one of the most powerful Imperial technologies to the battlefronts of the galaxy, but the enemies it would be fielded against were not those Vulcan expected. By the time the project was complete and Vulcan disseminated this improved design across the legions, Horus was already planning the first stages of his rebellion. The legions, loyal and traitor alike, are known to have received the plans, and therefore the ability to manufacture the suits, around the same time of the traitor legions culling of their ranks at Istvan III, and by the time the loyalist Retribution fleet deployed to Istvan V, the mark was in use by both sides. The drop site massacre, in which the Salamanders Legion were decimated, would, ironically, be the first test of the new suits on the field of battle, and they go on to be fielded in some of the heaviest fighting of the war, right through to the Siege of Terra itself. At least that's the story now. But how did we end up with this? Let's start at the start. Many of the models in the Horus Heresy game system are throwbacks to early miniature designs from the very early days of Warhammer. There's this fun thing Games Workshop do where they take a really old miniature design from the 80s and then say, oh yeah, this is the venerated ancient pattern from long ago in World 2. And the Horus Heresy, being a bit of a nostalgia fest, is full of that sort of thing. This all started with the old Horus Heresy card game and the Visions of Heresy books from the very early 2000s, way before the novels or the tabletop game were released. For this card game, loads of non-Games Workshop artists were employed, people who weren't necessarily steeped in the lore of 40k. And to make the art look like it was from an earlier era of the Imperium, rather than insisting the artists drew the current range of models at the time, they were just given free rein to draw their inspiration from models from the past. So out of this, all this crazy art in multiple styles from multiple eras, came the idea that the old models were in fact old marks of equipment in world, and then settings like the Horus Heresy have mined that ever since. Horus Heresy rhinos and predators are based on the original plastic models from the early 90s, now renamed Demos pattern, as opposed to the more 40k style Mars pattern. The Horus Heresy Deredeo Dreadnought is named after one of the original Rogue Trader Ball Dreadnoughts, these guys, but its design takes inspiration from the Chaos Dreadnought, found in the old Space Crusade board game and in the old Epic 6mm game system. And this stretches into the novels too. The original Imperial Space Marine, coded LE2 on release, is a character in the Horus Heresy novels, Litu, one of the first Space Marines to be created by the Emperor. And so it's appropriate that Saturnine Terminator armour is one of these. The inspiration for these new models is this guy, one of the earliest Terminator models released by Games Workshop. Though I say one of because it's not the first one. This relic mark is actually kind of concurrent with all the rest of the Terminator designs. This guy, the Eggenator, I'll call him, is one of 3 variant Terminator armor models released in late 1988 or early 1989. Along with big shoulders, we also have the Turtleback Terminator and this guy, who looks like a simplified version of a normal Terminator. All 3 of these were pictured in various bits of artwork, first seen around the same time, late 88, early 89. But while it's tempting to call these ones original Terminators or the earliest Terminators, you sometimes see fans refer to this particular design as Mark I Terminator armor, they were actually released at the same time as normal Terminators, the ones we would now call Indomitus. The RBT9 box came out in April 1989 at about the same time as these 3 variant ones. It's much more likely, given how Games Workshop worked back then, that all of these designs were potential options for what Terminators could be. It's just that this one won in the end. And then they decided to release them all anyway as curiosities. Anyway, for whatever reason, these guys became the standard Terminators way later, given the name Indomitus pattern, and the other 3 were consigned to the nostalgia vaults for decades. None of them were ever given a name, and none of them even turned up in that Visions of Heresy series in the early 2000s. Instead, that's where we got this new Cataphracti pattern. And certainly nothing mentions anything called Saturnine. In order to get there, we need to fast forward 25 years to the very first tabletop Horus Heresy gamebook, Betrayal, released in 2012. In here, we get one specific excerpt in the description about the different heresy marks of armor. That there is another mark called Saturnine, but that it's broadly the same as Indomitus. And that's it. That's the first time that is used to refer to Terminators. That same lore turns up in a Warhammer community article a few years ago. The 2nd edition Age of Darkness rulebook, released in 2022, lists Saturnine as being developed during the Heresy, and then that's it. Those are the only mentions in any book pre-2024 of the Saturnine Terminator, a sort of armor that is functionally identical to the more normal Indomitus armor, but with no depiction and no link to any old models. The word pops up elsewhere. Mostly it's how they refer to stuff from Saturn, which makes sense. It's also the name of one of the walls of the Imperial Palace, where Abaddon launches a sneak attack during the Siege of Terror, but that's much, much later on and doesn't use any Saturnine Terminators, so it's not really relevant. Basically, Based on this description, if I had to pick an old mark of Terminator armour and figure out which one is going to be called Saturnine, I would probably have picked this one. I mean, it looks the most like Indomitus armour after all. But that doesn't mean that these guys have been totally forgotten. Our big-shouldered friends turn up again in Deeds Endured, a short story by Gav Thorpe. In this, we're told that the Salamanders intended to debut a prototype sort of Terminator armour, pictured here, at Istvan, but in the wake of the drop site massacre, they try and secure that design from being stolen by Horus. As his eyes adjusted, Kratos recognised Terminator armour, but unlike anything he'd seen in a long time, the war plate of the Terminators was far broader and taller than standard legionary power armour, and these had an additional exoskeletal frame, carrying slanted plates of extra armour, all decorated in the dark green livery of the Salamanders. Their left hands were fashioned in a variety of powered fists, claws and chain blades, designed for close assault, anti-armour assault and bulkhead cutting, and in the right they carried an assortment of weapons ranging from simple combi bolters to triple-barreled autocannons, plasma chargers and rocket launchers, and one carried an immensely rare long-muzzled Volkite culverin. Yeah, it was not these amendments that amazed Kratos. The Iron Hands had numerous experimental suits of Terminator armour with modified heavy weaponry and ablative shields. What stole the curse from Kratos' lips was the additional weapon systems mounted across the backpacks and shoulders of the Terminators. A plethora of armour-piercing missiles, las cannons, multi-melters and conversion beamers were all pointing in his direction. Each was quite literally a walking tank. The Salamander, piloting the lead of these suits, Pyre Warden Arii, says that Vulcan was developing these suits prior to Istvan, and the short also mentions that Kratos hasn't seen anything like them in a long time, which of course implies that these big shoulder suits, illustrated here in the illustration that goes with the story, did exist in the lore before this, but like a very long time ago. So that all adds up with what we've got now, but when questioned afterwards, the author Gav Thorpe said these weren't the missing Saturnine pattern. I mean, obviously they're not, right? There's no way these are basically the same as Indomitus, which is what it said in Betrayal. Gav Thorpe said if they had a name, he'd call them something like Promethean or Nocturne pattern. So up until this year, we had two different bits of lore going on. A big-shouldered Terminator, obviously influenced by the old Rogue Trader model, and confirmed to be an early design that was modified by Vulcan just before the Heresy, and a different thing called Saturnine Terminator armour, which was broadly the same as Indomitus armour, and those were completely different things. Of course, what changed was fans. At some point, these two things became merged in the minds of a lot of the fan base, I think because of two reasons. First, the notoriously inaccurate 40k wiki just started calling this design Saturnine, with no lore to back it up, but they just decided that was what it was called, and loads of people just read the wiki, they don't actually read the books. And then secondly, 3D model makers stole that design and started to make modernized copies of it. People remembered the old Egginator, and once Deeds Endure came out, they were like, well, they're in Heresy now, and they wanted those models, and they needed a name to refer to it by. So for one reason or another, the fan base just started calling this armour Saturnine, despite it being described as something completely different. And that was the case up until the release of 3rd edition Heresy, where it seems that Games Workshop have just run with it. They could have released this mark of armour and called it anything they wanted. There's a few other names for lost forms of Terminator armour floating around out there, but instead they've changed the admittedly minimal lore, it was only one paragraph, to match what the fans were calling this anyway. You do see that occasionally in Warhammer. For example, there's a few Space Marine chapters that originated as a fan's custom chapter and were later made official. But I do find it a bit weird here. The only people that are proven right here are the people who write the wiki and just make stuff up, and people making knockoff 3D models with Games Workshop IP, which, you know, it doesn't seem like the sort of thing the company would be supporting, right? In fact, the wiki that linked these two things together to start with is already up to its old tricks again. As I type this, the article on Saturnine Terminator armour, obviously incorporating all the new information, also just makes up a whole load of lore to explain why the Deeds Endure suits look a bit different. Just pages of content here pulled from thin air. And Games Workshop aren't doing any better themselves. As I edit this, the new White Dwarf has sort of massaged this story a bit in the background. Apparently, according to this, the original mention of Saturnine armour back in Betrayal heralded rumours that it was the big shoulder type. I mean, rumours that weren't actually published anywhere, not in any, actual official publications. I don't know where that came from. And also that the existence of Saturnine was confirmed in Deeds Endured, which is also weird considering that the author says they weren't confirming anything. Fake nerd news, Games Workshop. But anyway, that's all happened now. This is what's happened. The big shouldered suit is now officially called Saturnine armour, but it wasn't before. And it's a relatively rare case of Games Workshop just changing a bit of lore to be in line with what everyone was doing anyway. Personally, I would have liked it to have been a bit more of a mystery. Like, I would have loved to discover that this big shouldered suit is the rare Arcanak pattern or something, and that Saturnine was these guys. I think that would have made more sense, but the time has passed, and forevermore, this design is now Saturnine Terminator armour. Also, before we get to the end of this video, I will say Saturnine Dreadnoughts are entirely new. They've never been mentioned before, but I do enjoy how the design makes it look like a stopgap between a Leviathan Dreadnought and the more advanced Custodes Telemon Dreadnought. I think there's some good, non-Martian design synchronicity there. But yeah, that is the story of Saturnine Terminator armour, both its lore in the world and its weird development history. Plodding from the pages of a 1980s Warhammer book and back onto the gaming table. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the history of the Horus Heresy and Warhammer, then there's probably a video popping up to the right there. And of course, we have merch, and you can like and subscribe and support the channel and join the Patreon and all the other things you would expect of a YouTuber. Links for all that are in the thing below. See ya.